At 84 years old, Bob Dylan is still one of the most talked about names in music history. For decades, people have called him a genius, a poet, even a mystery. His songs shaped generations. His words became protest signs. His voice, rough, sharp, different, became unforgettable. But behind the awards, the sold-out tours and the history books, there is a man who has carried a quiet weight for most of his life. Many fans see the legend. They see the stage lights, the harmonica, the guitar, and the serious face under the hat. But very few stop and think about the lonely boy he once was, or the older man he is today. At 84, life feels different. The world moves faster. Friends are gone. The body slows down. Fame doesn't feel the same as it once did. And the noise of the past can grow louder in the silence of the present. Bob Dylan has never been someone who explains himself. He avoids interviews. He keeps his private life locked away. That silence has only made people more curious. What was his childhood really like? What did fame cost him? What did he lose while the world was cheering? If you love Bob Dylan and respect the life he's lived, don't forget to like this video. Now let's go back to the beginning. Bob Dylan wasn't born Bob Dylan. He was born Robert Zimmerman in 1941 in the cold city of Duluth. Not long after, his family moved to a small mining town called Hibbing. It wasn't a glamorous place. It was quiet, simple. Snow covered most of the year. Hibbing was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. Life followed routines. People worked hard. Families stayed close. It was safe, but it could also feel small. Robert grew up in a Jewish household. His grandparents were immigrants. His parents wanted stability for him. They wanted a normal life. School, work, family, the American dream. But even as a young boy, Robert felt different. He wasn't the strongest kid. He wasn't the most popular. He was quiet, observant. He listened more than he spoke. He paid attention to sounds, the radio, especially. Music became his escape. He loved rock and roll. He loved country. He loved the feeling that music came from somewhere bigger than his small town. When he heard artists on the radio, it felt like they were calling him. School wasn't where he felt alive. He wasn't failing, but he wasn't inspired either. He spent more time thinking about bands than homework. He formed little music groups as a teenager, playing at school dances and local events. It wasn't serious yet, but it mattered to him. There was also something else growing inside him, restlessness. Hibbing felt too small for his dreams. He didn't want to work in the mines. He didn't want to live the same life as everyone else. He wanted movement, noise, change. His parents worried. They saw their son drifting away from the safe path. Music didn't look stable. It didn't look practical. It looked risky. But Robert kept going. He started changing small things. The way he dressed. The way he talked. The way he presented himself. It was like he was slowly stepping into a new identity. By the time he finished high school, he already knew one thing clearly. He was not staying in Hibbing forever. The quiet boy with the radio dreams was getting ready to leave. After high school, Robert enrolled at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. On paper, it looked like he was doing the responsible thing. College, education, a future. But something else was happening. Minneapolis had a small but active folk music scene. Coffee houses, small stages, young people with guitars singing old songs. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't rich. But it was honest. That's where he discovered folk music deeply. And that's where he found the music of Woody Guthrie. Woody Guthrie wasn't polished. He wasn't glamorous. He sang about workers, struggle, dust, hunger. His songs felt real. They felt close to the ground. Robert was hooked. He started performing in coffee houses under different names. He slowly left Robert Zimmerman behind and began introducing himself as Bob Dylan. The name change wasn't random. It was part of the transformation. He wasn't just changing a name, he was building a new version of himself. College classes became less important. Music became everything. He dressed differently. He studied old folk records. He practiced constantly. He started talking about heading east, to New York City. That's where the real music scene was. That's where Woody Guthrie was. Dropping out of college wasn't easy. It meant disappointing his parents. It meant giving up stability. But he felt pulled towards something bigger than fear. In 1961, he made the decision. He left Minnesota. He didn't have much money. He didn't have a guarantee. What he had was belief, and a guitar. When Bob Dylan arrived in New York City, it was winter. Cold. Gray. Unforgiving. New York was nothing like Hibbing. It was loud. Fast. Competitive. Nobody cared where you came from. Nobody handed you opportunities. He stayed in small apartments. Slept on couches. Played wherever he could. Coffee houses in Greenwich Village became his classroom. That's where he learned how to hold a crowd. That's where he sharpened his lyrics. One of his main reasons for coming to New York was to see Woody Guthrie, who was seriously ill and in the hospital. Dylan visited him, played songs for him, sat by his bedside. It meant everything to him. But admiration didn't pay rent. There were nights when he barely had money. Nights when he wondered if he had made a mistake. Record labels weren't lining up at first. He was just another young guy with a guitar. Still, something about him stood out. His lyrics were different. They weren't simple love songs. They had questions, anger, observation. Slowly, people started paying attention. In 1962, he signed a record deal. It wasn't huge. It wasn't glamorous. But it was a start. The boy from Minnesota was no longer just dreaming. He was stepping into something real, and the world was about to notice. The early 1960s were tense in America. Civil rights protests, war debates, social change everywhere. Bob Dylan's songs began to match that mood. Blowin' in the Wind spread quickly. College students sang it. Protesters quoted it. Suddenly, he wasn't just a musician, he was being called the voice of a generation. That label sounded powerful. But it was heavy. He didn't ask to carry a movement on his shoulders. He was just writing what he saw and felt. But once the media decided he represented something bigger, it became hard to escape. Fame came fast. Interviews, tours, crowds, expectations. Every new song was analyzed. Every word examined. People wanted him to stay the same, to keep writing protest songs, to stay politically clear. But Bob Dylan didn't like being boxed in. When he started experimenting with electric music, some fans felt betrayed. At the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, when he played electric guitar, part of the crowd booed. They felt he had turned his back on them. That moment hurt more than he showed. He wasn't trying to betray anyone. He was growing. But growth isn't always welcomed. By the mid-1960s, he was exhausted. The touring schedule was intense. The pressure constant. Fame, which once felt exciting, started to feel like a trap. The man who once wanted to escape a small town was now surrounded by noise he couldn't control. And the strain was building. By 1966, Bob Dylan was exhausted. The tours never seemed to stop. The crowds were bigger. The arguments were louder. Some fans still hadn't forgiven him for going electric. Reporters followed him everywhere. Every word he said was printed. Every move he made was judged. He looked calm on stage, but behind the scenes, he was worn down. Then came the motorcycle accident. In July 1966, near his home in Woodstock, he crashed his motorcycle. The details have always been a little unclear. Some say it wasn't as serious as people thought. Others believe it was worse than reported. What is clear is that the crash gave him something he hadn't had in years, a reason to disappear. Suddenly, the tours were cancelled. The noise stopped. For the first time in a long time, he was home. Physically, he needed rest. Accidents shake the body. Even if bones aren't broken, something inside feels different. Pain lingers. Weakness shows up in small ways. But the emotional side may have been even heavier. He had been running at full speed since the early 60s. The accident forced him to slow down. It forced him to sit still. And sitting still can be uncomfortable when you've built your life on movement. During that time, he stayed mostly out of the public eye. Rumors spread. Some people said he was seriously injured. Some said he was hiding. Some even questioned if it happened the way it was reported. But Dylan didn't explain himself. He rarely does. He focused on home life. On quiet days. On writing without pressure. The world kept spinning without him on stage every night. That must have felt strange, realizing the machine keeps going even when you step away. He wasn't the young man sleeping on couches anymore. He wasn't just the angry voice of protest either. He was a husband. A father. A man trying to breathe. The accident marked the end of one intense chapter. When he returned to music later, something had shifted. The sound was different. The urgency was softer. The edge had changed. The crash may have lasted seconds. But the pause that followed lasted much longer. After stepping back from constant touring, Bob Dylan spent more time focusing on family. He had married Sarah Lones in 1965. They built a life together away from the spotlight as much as possible.
They had children. From the outside, it looked calm. A house. A yard.
A normal rhythm. But being married to someone like Bob Dylan was never going to be simple. Fame doesn't stay outside the front door.
It follows you home.
Strangers recognize you. The press wants details. Rumors spread easily. Balancing family and fame is hard for anyone. For someone as guarded as Dylan, it was even harder. He valued privacy deeply. But the world didn't always respect that. In the late 1970s, another major shift happened: his spiritual transformation. He became openly Christian for a period of time and released gospel-influenced albums. For some fans, this was confusing. For others, it felt like betrayal again. They wanted the old Bob Dylan back. The protest singer. The poet of the streets. Instead, they got songs about faith and salvation. Concert crowds reacted differently. Some were supportive. Others were critical. Reviews were mixed. The pressure returned in a new way, not about electric guitars this time, but about belief.
Faith is personal.
But when you're famous, even your personal journey becomes public debate. At home, his marriage began to struggle. Tension builds quietly over years.
Touring. Fame. Expectations.
Differences in direction. In 1977, Bob Dylan and Sarah divorced. Divorce is painful, no matter who you are.
It's not just paperwork.
It's shared history.
It's children.
It's memories in rooms that suddenly feel empty. He kept working. He kept touring. But personal cracks were there. In the early 1980s, his music changed again. The strong religious focus softened.
He shifted styles.
Some albums were praised. Others were criticized harshly. Critics began to question if his best days were behind him. Hearing that repeatedly can wear on a person. For someone who never liked being labeled, he had now been labeled many times: protest singer, electric rebel, Christian convert, fading legend. Through it all, he stayed quiet in interviews. He didn't defend himself much. He let the music speak. But silence doesn't mean the pressure disappears. Inside, there were conflicts about identity, belief, direction, family.
He kept moving forward.
But the road was never smooth. As the years went on, Bob Dylan did something few expected.
He kept touring.
What became known as the Never-Ending Tour started in the late 1980s and continued for decades.
City after city. Country after country.
Even as he aged, he stayed on stage. Touring is not easy at any age.
It means long flights, late nights, different beds, constant travel.
As he grew older, the physical strain increased. In 1997, he faced a serious health scare. He was hospitalized with a heart infection called histoplasmosis. It was dangerous. For a moment, the world wondered if this was the end. Recovery wasn't instant. Infections that affect the heart are serious, especially for someone constantly on the road.
But he returned. He always returned.
Still, aging doesn't negotiate. Energy shifts.
The voice changes. Movements slow down.
Audiences notice.
Some accept it.
Some compare him to the younger version of himself. That comparison can be painful. Being measured against your own past is heavy. He also watched many of his peers pass away. Fellow musicians.
Old friends.
Faces from the early 60s scene. With each loss, the circle grew smaller. Living into your 80s is a gift. But it also means saying goodbye more often. Even in his 70s and early 80s, Dylan continued to release music. He even received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2016, a rare honor for a songwriter.
Some celebrated it. Others debated it.
He didn't rush to the ceremony. He didn't give long emotional speeches.
He stayed consistent, distant, thoughtful, private.
Now at 84, he moves more slowly. Public appearances are rare. The world sees glimpses, a performance here, a photograph there. But the body carries decades of travel, stress, noise. The boy from Hibbing who once dreamed of escape has lived many lives inside one lifetime. And time, as it does for everyone, keeps moving forward. When Bob Dylan was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2016, the world reacted with surprise. Some people celebrated it immediately. Others argued about it for weeks. News anchors debated whether a songwriter deserved a literature prize. Social media was loud. Critics wrote long essays. And in the middle of all that noise, Dylan stayed mostly quiet. He didn't rush to give interviews. He didn't stand in front of cameras explaining his feelings. For days, there was uncertainty about whether he would even acknowledge the award. That silence only made the conversation bigger. Eventually, he accepted it in his own way.
Not dramatic. Not emotional.
Just steady and controlled. That moment said a lot about him. After more than 5 decades of being studied, praised, criticized, and labeled, he still refused to perform the role people expected. Even with one of the highest honors in the world, he didn't suddenly open up or become sentimental in public. But honors don't remove loneliness. By the time he reached his late 70s and early 80s, most of the people who had walked beside him in the early years were gone. Fellow artists from the 1960s. Producers.
Old friends from coffeehouse days.
Some died from illness.
Some from age.
Some from long, hard lives. When you live that long, your memories become crowded with faces that are no longer here. Crowds still showed up to see him perform. The applause was real. The respect was real. But applause fades quickly once the lights go down. Hotel rooms are quiet. Backstage rooms empty out.
Airports blur together.
Even surrounded by staff and musicians, a person can feel alone. Dylan has always protected his private life. He rarely shares details about his daily routine. He doesn't post personal updates. He doesn't invite cameras into his home. That privacy keeps mystery alive, but it also creates distance. People feel like they know him because they know his songs. But songs don't tell you everything. As he aged, his voice changed more noticeably. It became rougher, lower, sometimes harder to understand. Some fans accepted it as part of growing older. Others complained online, comparing him to recordings from 1965 or 1975. Imagine being measured against your 24-year-old self when you're over 80. That pressure doesn't fully disappear, even if you pretend it doesn't matter. There's also something heavy about being called a legend. It sounds like praise. But it can also feel like being turned into a statue while you're still alive. Statues don't get to grow.
They don't get to change.
For decades, Dylan fought against being frozen in one image. First, they wanted him to stay the protest singer. Then they wanted him to stay electric. Then they wanted him to stay controversial. Then they wanted him to stay young. At 84, staying young isn't an option. Reports about his health come and go. Shorter tours, more careful scheduling, fewer appearances. The body simply doesn't recover the way it once did. Yet he continued to record music even into his late 70s and early 80s. Albums that reflected on mortality, history, long roads, fading figures.
The themes felt heavier, slower,
less urgent, more reflective, though he would never frame it that way himself. There is something different about singing songs about death and time when you are in your 20s versus when you are in your 80s. In his younger years, those themes felt poetic.
Now they feel close.
Fans still line up outside venues. They still wear old tour shirts. They still debate which album was his best. But the man at the center of it all walks through side doors quietly. He doesn't wave much. He doesn't give long speeches.
He plays the songs. Then he leaves.
The loneliness of a legend isn't always loud. It's not dramatic.
It's subtle.
It's in the quiet drive after a show. It's in reading headlines about yourself that don't feel personal. It's in knowing millions of people feel connected to you, while only a handful truly know you.
At 84, the world still sees Bob Dylan.
But very few see the aging man behind the name. At 84, life moves differently. For Bob Dylan, mornings likely feel slower than they once did. The body takes a moment to adjust. Muscles don't respond as quickly. Energy isn't automatic. Every person who reaches their 80s understands this quiet shift. He spent most of his life moving, touring, recording, traveling across continents. Now, even if he still performs occasionally, the pace cannot be the same. The world he entered in the early 1960s barely exists anymore. Record stores have disappeared. Music is streamed. Interviews are clipped into short online videos.
Attention spans are shorter.
Fame works differently. He belongs to a different era. That can feel isolating. When he first arrived in New York in 1961, the folk scene felt intimate.
Coffee houses.
Handwritten lyrics.
Word-of-mouth buzz.
Now music spreads in seconds across the internet. The landscape changed many times during his lifetime. He adapted over and over again. But at some point, adapting becomes tiring. Physically, aging brings quiet battles. Even without major public illness, the normal aches of an 84-year-old body are real.
Joints stiffen. Vision shifts. Hearing changes.
Travel becomes more demanding. Every performance likely requires more preparation than it did decades ago. Rest matters more. Recovery takes longer. Emotionally, there is also weight. He has children and grandchildren. Family life becomes more central as public life slows. But family also means watching younger generations grow up in a world very different from the one he knew. And then there is memory. An 84-year-old carries decades inside his mind. Rooms filled with faces. Studios filled with smoke and arguments and laughter.
Endless highways. Old hotel keys.
Newspaper headlines announcing triumphs and controversies. Memory can comfort you. It can also overwhelm you. Many of the artists he once shared stages with are gone. The 1960s crowd has thinned. Each passing year likely brings news of another loss. Funerals replace festivals. Being one of the last standing from a generation carries a strange feeling. There is pride in survival, but also sadness in being left behind. Despite everything, Dylan has never tried to turn himself into a sentimental public figure. He doesn't give farewell tours filled with emotional speeches. He doesn't narrate his life story in detail.
He remains guarded.
But even guarded people feel time. In recent years, he sold the rights to much of his song catalog in a massive business deal. To some, it looked like a smart financial decision. To others, it felt symbolic, like closing a chapter. Letting go of ownership over songs that defined your life is not small. Those songs carried his youth, his anger, his hope. Now, they belong to history in a different way. The hands that once strummed through the night now move more carefully. The voice that once shocked audiences now carries the texture of age. The man who once ran from small-town silence now lives inside a different kind of quiet. The spotlight fades slowly, not all at once. And in that softer light, there is an elderly man who has lived many lives, who has seen the world change again and again, who has carried praise, criticism, reinvention, faith, doubt, love, and loss. At 84, Bob Dylan is no longer chasing anything.
He walks slower. He speaks less.
He remains a mystery. But behind the mystery is a human being facing the same truth every 84-year-old faces. Time does not stop, not even for legends.